Have you ever wondered what really hides beneath the glittering surface of one of the most admired civilizations in history? When most people think of ancient Egypt, they imagine the golden glow of the pyramids under the desert sun, vast temples carved with precision that defies belief, and the serene faces of statues that seem to whisper secrets across millennia. It all feels otherworldly, almost divine, as if Egypt was touched by the gods themselves. But behind that facade of brilliance and majesty was a side of life so unsettling that it rarely makes its way into the stories told in classrooms or tourist brochures. And that's exactly where we are going today. This is not about feeding the fantasy of noble pharaohs or untouchable beauty. It's about peeling back the mask and staring into a reality far darker than most would ever imagine. What you are about to hear may disturb you. It may even make you question how we define civilization itself. But if we want to understand Egypt honestly, we cannot look away. Before we dive deep, take a second to subscribe to this channel. Leave a like if you enjoy exploring the untold corners of history, and share in the comments which side of Egypt fascinates you more, the towering achievements or the hidden brutality. Your voice helps keep this conversation alive, and together we can dig deeper into truths often left in the shadows. Now, let's walk into a world few dare to explore, the forbidden, the terrifying, and the deeply human practices that shaped Egyptian society. The people of the Nile saw sexuality as more than private behavior. It was cosmic, political, and spiritual. It wove through every fiber of their culture, dictating who held power, who was subjugated, and even how the universe itself was believed to function. And one of the most chilling truths is how slavery and conquest fed directly into this system. Victorious pharaohs and nobles did not just take gold, land, or livestock from the people they conquered. They took bodies. Men and women alike were dragged back as spoils of war, their fates sealed not only as laborers but often as sexual property. To the Egyptian elite, intimacy was just another extension of domination. The bedchamber became a second battlefield, and the bodies of the conquered became reminders of who held power and who had none. It was not a few isolated cases. It was systemic. Imagine for a moment the life of a peasant struggling to feed a family in the relentless heat of the Nile Valley. While above them in the palaces of Thebes or Memphis, nobles used war captives however they pleased, never seeing them as human beings but as trophies to be broken in both body and spirit. That was Egypt too, the splendor of monuments casting long shadows over unspeakable cruelty. But perhaps what's even more disturbing is how religion, the beating heart of Egyptian life, absorbed sexuality into its rituals. Myths like that of Osiris were not just bedtime stories. They were blueprints for ceremonies that demanded human reenactments. Picture a priestess, not acting out a symbolic gesture, but being compelled to physically embody the goddess in a ritual union with a god represented by another priest or by a sacred object. To the Egyptians, this was cosmic duty. To us, it looks like coercion hidden behind the veil of divine necessity. The obsession with fertility pushed the boundaries of what could be considered acceptable, even in the ancient world. Papyri tell us of remedies and rituals that sound more grotesque than medicinal, recipes calling for the consumption of bodily fluids like semen or menstrual blood, sometimes even animal waste, all with the belief that these substances could guarantee virility or bless a barren womb with children. These were not fringe practices. They were preserved in texts meant to guide physicians and priests. It tells us something powerful. The human body was not just a vessel of life in Egypt. It was a laboratory, a canvas for experiments fueled by desperation, fear, and superstition. And then we step into the territory most haunting of all, the intersection of sexuality and death. In their attempt to control every aspect of life and afterlife, The Egyptians even found ways to blur these boundaries. Some ancient records suggest embalmers were specifically warned not to begin preparing the bodies of young women immediately after death, because there was a real fear, perhaps even a known practice, of them being violated in that vulnerable state. The fact that such warnings existed at all should stop us cold. It means necrophilic abuse was not just a nightmare scenario invented later, but a danger grave enough to require preventive measures. Imagine a society so entrenched in ritual and power that even the silence of death was not enough to protect the body from violation. But if you think the story ends there, you are mistaken. We haven't yet touched the most famous, and perhaps the most unsettling custom tied to Egypt's ruling class: incest within the royal family. For the pharaoh, who was seen not as a man but as a living god, bloodlines mattered more than anything. Purity of lineage was considered divine necessity. That's why fathers married daughters, brothers married sisters, uncles claimed nieces, and dynasties wove themselves into knots of genetic fragility. These were not slanders invented by enemies. They are written in the genealogies and etched into the very DNA of mummies studied by modern science. The consequences were devastating. Generations of rulers were plagued by deformities, illnesses, and frailty, all because their society chose to elevate divine purity over human well-being. Now, it is tempting to think women in Egypt had freedoms unknown elsewhere in the ancient world. And in some respects, they did: legal rights to property, to inheritance, even to business. But these rights existed within a world where their bodies were constantly monitored and controlled. Fertility tests could be invasive and humiliating, reducing women to vessels whose only value lay in their ability to bear children. Failure was not just personal heartbreak. It could mean rejection, shame, or abandonment. A woman's sexuality did not belong to her. It belonged to the family, to the gods, and ultimately to the state. And while this was happening, the slave markets of Egypt turned human suffering into a business. Children captured in wars or born into servitude were sold without hesitation, their futures traded like livestock. Some were forced into lives as concubines, their childhoods erased by the demands of men who saw them not as people but as possessions. Imagine walking through the bustling markets along the Nile, where papyrus scrolls and pottery might be sold beside human lives offered up as private indulgences for the wealthy. Behind the gold masks of pharaohs, behind the monumental walls of Karnak and Luxor, lay countless stories of those who would never have their names carved in stone. So while the river flooded each year, nourishing the land and sustaining life, sexuality in Egypt reflected something much darker. It was not intimacy and it was not love. It was a weapon, a symbol, a tool wielded in the service of hierarchy, superstition, and unchecked power. And what we have touched on so far is only the beginning. The deeper we dig, the more unsettling it becomes, because Egypt's rituals did not just bend the boundaries of what we had considered human. They shattered them. This is why I invite you again, before we move on, to subscribe and make sure notifications are on. What's ahead is even more disturbing, and I want you to be part of uncovering these truths. Leave a comment below what strikes you the most so far: the enslavement of captives, the rituals of fertility, or the royal incest that weakened dynasties. Your perspective adds depth to this exploration. And trust me, we've only scratched the surface. As disturbing as the customs we've already uncovered may be, they were only the surface of something deeper, stranger, and far more unsettling. Because when you look closer at Egyptian society, you realize sexuality was not confined to private spaces or limited to isolated rituals. It spilled into festivals, ceremonies, and public life in ways that forced everyone, willing or not, to participate. One of the clearest examples of this lies in their fertility festivals. Imagine entire crowds called together in the name of cosmic balance, priests standing before them with drums and chants, declaring that the gods demanded renewal through acts of pleasure. What followed was not just singing and dancing. These festivals often erupted into mass rituals where sexuality itself was performed publicly, woven into music, movement, and ceremony. It was not optional. Participation was framed as a duty, as a sacred act that ensured the Nile would flood, crops would grow, and the universe itself would stay in order. To us, these gatherings look like chaos dressed up as religion, blurring the line between devotion and coercion. But to the Egyptians, refusal was unthinkable. To decline was to invite punishment, exclusion, or even divine wrath as proclaimed by the priests who held so much power. Imagine the pressure of standing in a crowd where the entire community turns toward you, expecting you to submit, your choice swallowed by the will of gods and rulers alike. And when it came to women, control only grew harsher. Virginity, something deeply bound to ideas of purity and lineage, was never treated as a private matter. Accounts suggest that before marriage, young women might be subjected to examinations overseen by priests or physicians, all under the guise of confirming their purity. Picture the humiliation of being reduced to an object under scrutiny, your body declared either worthy or tainted by those with absolute authority. It was not about protecting the individual, it was about protecting the family's honor, the state's order, and the cosmic narrative Egypt lived by. A woman's autonomy dissolved before she even had a chance to claim it. Her body was not her own. It belonged to her lineage, her husband, and the gods who supposedly demanded such proof. But even this does not reveal the full extent of how Egypt blurred boundaries. Ancient myths, later expanded upon by Greek and Roman observers, tell us of rituals where sacred animals, creatures believed to embody the divine, were central to acts of union. Bulls, rams, and other animals associated with gods were not just symbols in these stories. Some accounts suggest priestesses may have been compelled to physically unite with them in ceremonies framed as sacred. Now, whether these acts were literal or symbolic is still debated by scholars. But the fact that such stories existed at all, carried forward in testimony, tells us something crucial. In the Egyptian imagination, the boundary between human and animal could dissolve entirely when it came to preserving cosmic order. For them, no act was too extreme if it meant sustaining harmony between heaven and earth. Magic too crept into this realm, and not the playful, mysterious kind we picture today. Erotic magic was a dark tool designed to manipulate desire, stripping people of their will. Surviving papyri detail spells made from fingernails, fragments of corpses, and bodily fluids, mixed into amulets or potions intended to bind someone to another against their will. These were not gestures of affection. They were instruments of control. A person could be forced into attraction, shackled by sorcery that twisted love into a curse. Think about that for a moment. Affection, one of the most personal human emotions, turned into a weapon. For the Egyptians, love did not have to be chosen. It could be conjured, coerced, and enslaved through ritual. But what comes next is perhaps the darkest revelation of all: the exploitation of children. Official records rarely say it outright, but there are enough indirect references to suggest that boys and girls captured in wars, or even born into slavery, were sold for purposes that go beyond labor. Pharaohs and elites had no hesitation in turning innocence into a commodity, transforming the most vulnerable into objects of desire. The silence of official history speaks volumes here, because silence itself is often a shield for practices too horrific to document openly. And yet the whispers, the fragments, the scattered hints tell us enough. In Egypt, childhood was no protection against the machinery of power and exploitation. Even death itself was not free of this world. In funerary rituals, there were beliefs that the virility of the deceased needed to be activated to secure their passage into eternity. That meant women could be compelled to stimulate the bodies of dead men, performing acts that today we'd find almost unthinkable. To the Egyptians, this was necessity. To us, it is macabre proof that for them, sex was not confined to life. It stretched into death, binding mortality and eternity together in ways that defy comprehension. And humiliation, too, was weaponized. When Egypt conquered enemies, their defeat did not end on the battlefield. Prisoners could be subjected to sexual abuse in public ceremonies, forced to endure acts meant to strip away every shred of dignity. It was not about desire. It was about power, about making sure everyone watching understood. Egypt did not just conquer your land, your people, or your gods. Egypt conquered you entirely, even in the most private corners of your being. These displays were propaganda in its rawest form, brutal messages carved into human flesh rather than stone. Then there were forced marriages, often involving peasant women ordered to wed soldiers or officials by decree. These were not unions of choice, of affection, or of compatibility. They were contracts, arranged by the state to secure loyalty, distribute land, or bind families into political convenience. Imagine being told one day that your future was no longer yours, that you would be married not for love, but because the pharaoh's government required it. In these cases, sexuality itself became nothing more than a transaction, a duty performed to strengthen the gears of power. And perhaps one of the most haunting practices of all was ritual prostitution. Although hard to fully document, travelers and later accounts describe women being compelled to offer themselves within temple walls, framed as acts of worship. In these spaces, desire became a sacred currency, and those most vulnerable paid the highest price. A temple that should have been a sanctuary could become instead a stage for exploitation, cloaked in the language of holiness. When we take all of these pieces together, the fertility festivals demanding public obedience, the humiliating virginity tests, the blurred lines of animal rituals, the binding spells of erotic magic, the exploitation of children, the funerary rites laced with sexuality, the humiliation of prisoners, the forced marriages, and the ritualized prostitution, a chilling image emerges. Sexuality in Egypt was not about intimacy or connection. It was about power, control, and submission. It was about bending the most personal aspects of human life to the service of politics and religion. The Nile gave life to the land, but the practices tied to sexuality gave power to those at the top, reinforcing hierarchies, silencing voices, and turning the sacred into a mask for domination. Behind every golden mask, behind every hieroglyph, behind every perfectly carved temple column was a system that blurred the line between devotion and abuse, between ritual and violation. And this is only part of the picture, because if we step back even further, we see how these practices were not hidden in shame. They were paraded, sanctified, normalized as cosmic necessity. Egypt did not shy away from these extremes. It embraced them as central to its vision of the world. But that leaves us with an uncomfortable question. When we admire Egypt's wonders, are we celebrating achievements built on the suffering of countless silenced lives? Or can we separate the beauty from the brutality? Before we move into the final part of this journey, I want you to share your thoughts in the comments. Which of these practices unsettles you most? Was it the forced participation in fertility festivals, the humiliating virginity tests, the whispered accounts of child exploitation, or the belief that even the dead had to be touched by sexuality to find eternal life? Tell me what you think below, and do not forget to subscribe and turn on the bell icon so you won't miss the conclusion to this series. where we will pull together everything we have uncovered into a full, chilling picture of Egypt's hidden reality. And so, after walking through the shadows of ancient Egypt, after uncovering the rituals, the humiliations, the coercions, and the silences, we arrive at the question that lingers like an echo through time. Why? Why would a civilization so advanced, so brilliant in its architecture, its writing, its medicine, its art bind sexuality so tightly to control and domination? The answer lies not just in Egypt, but in the very structure of power itself. Because sex has always been more than desire. It is vulnerability. It is connection. It is creation. And for rulers, priests, and those who sit atop society, controlling it means controlling the essence of human life itself. In Egypt, this control became ritualized, transformed into ceremonies and laws, myths and customs, until no one could escape it. The people did not simply obey, they believed. They grew up inside a world where fertility festivals were celebrated, where virginity examinations were unquestioned, where erotic spells were feared, and where silence about abuses was the price of survival. In such a world, resistance was not just rebellion against rulers. It was rebellion against the gods. Think of how powerful that is, to live in a system where every private act, every intimate choice, every moment of human closeness was framed as part of the universe's survival. Imagine never being able to say no because saying no meant risking not only your life, but the balance of creation itself. Egypt mastered this, and it's this mastery, this binding of the cosmic to the personal, that made its system so enduring, so unshakable. But endurance does not mean purity. Behind the polished monuments and sacred texts, we find the suffering of those who had no voice, the children forced into silence, the women stripped of their dignity, the prisoners humiliated before cheering crowds, the lovers cursed into obedience by spells, even the dead pulled back into rituals that treated their bodies as vessels to be used rather than laid to rest. These people never appear in the glowing hieroglyphs on temple walls. Their stories were never carved into stone. Yet their shadows are there, hidden in the gaps, in the silences, in the fragments of accounts that survived only by accident. And that's why it's so important we talk about this. History is often written to glorify the victors, the rulers, the builders of monuments. But real history, the history of lived human experience, includes the pain, the control, the abuses that powered those monuments into existence. To admire Egypt's achievements without acknowledging the cost is to accept half a story, to fall in love with an illusion polished by time. So the next time you look at the pyramids, or at the golden mask of Tutankhamun, or at the intricate hieroglyphs carved into temple walls, remember what is not shown. Remember that behind the grandeur were lives constrained, bodies used, and voices silenced. Remember that the same civilization that gave the world incredible feats of architecture and knowledge also carried out acts that, by today's standards, are nothing short of brutal. And maybe that's the real lesson Egypt leaves us, that human brilliance and human cruelty are often intertwined, that the same hands capable of creating beauty are also capable of inflicting suffering, that civilizations rise not only on innovation, but also on control. And unless we are willing to see both sides, we risk falling for myths instead of truths. As we close this journey, ask yourself, what does it mean that some of humanity's greatest wonders were built alongside some of humanity's darkest practices? Can we celebrate one while condemning the other? Or are they inseparable, bound together like the light and shadow of the desert sun? I want to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below sharing what struck you most in this exploration. Was it the rituals that blurred the line between sacred and profane? the ways love itself could be twisted by magic, or the haunting silence of those who never got to tell their stories. And if you found this deep dive eye-opening, do not forget to subscribe, hit that like button, and tap the bell icon so you'll be the first to know when we explore more hidden corners of history. Because in the end, history is not just about kings, monuments, or victories. It's about people. And until we uncover every story, the celebrated and the silenced, we'll never truly understand the past. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Stay curious, stay questioning, and never stop looking beyond the surface.